Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of the Cloud Native Now podcast. I am Sharon Florentine. I'm here with Mike Vizard, and it is opening day for baseball, or it was this week anyway. We got some competing teams duking it out.
Oh, yeah.
Go Phils. Fightins. But switching gears a little bit, we talk a lot about platform engineering, both with regard to DevOps and to cloud native. And seems like, at least according to a survey that came out this week, I think it came out this week, there's actually been some gains made in this area.
Well, here's the part of it that's good, and here's the part of it that may be not so good. So on the one hand, it says that folks have been building these platforms for the better part of 3 years. So it's not like platform engineering is a wholly new idea.
Right.
Folks have been trying to get to that for a while. And, whether it requires another buzzword term, I don't know. It's kind of open to interpretation. I mean, it is a methodology, maybe more prescriptive methodology for managing DevOps at scale. So there's a little bit of nuance there. But from a cloud native perspective, here's the thing that kind of leapt out at me on the dark side of it. 46% of the folks who took this survey, which was the annual Puppet survey about DevOps, it's now Puppet by Perforce.
Yep.
And this survey's been going on for some time. So the folks who probably took this survey were not, neophytes. 46% said they had no plans for Kubernetes. Now, that tells me something about A, the platform itself in terms of its complexity, but B, I'm not entirely sure whether or not it's the platform or whether they just decided that microservices-based applications are not for them and they're just going to stick with monoliths and therefore they don't need Kubernetes. But what I'm starting to wonder is, are we reaching some level of saturation around Kubernetes adoption? Because I would say that the folks who have adopted it are certainly deploying more clusters, but it seems like there's a significant percentage of the population that just doesn't want to go.
Right.
And as that continues to happen, the base of organizations that will be using cloud native Kubernetes-based stacks is going to be finite. And so we're probably reaching the beginning of some level of saturation in the sense that, yeah, those organizations will continue to expand the number of clusters they have, but the total population of organizations that might be running Kubernetes might be growing at a slower rate from here on out. It's still early days, and we'll have to see how that actually plays out. But I'm kind of hoping that maybe something dramatic happens that makes Kubernetes more accessible to a wider range of folks. And there's certainly chatter about applying AI to the management of Kubernetes, and hopefully that might make it more accessible to folks. But what's your sense of what's going on here? You've been tracking this as long as I have.
Well, to your point about the lack of Kubernetes, one of the stats from the survey said that when folks were asked what their top goals were for platform engineering teams, only about a quarter, 26%, said that they wanted platform engineering to help them accelerate a transition to cloud native environments. So yeah, maybe it's the complexity, or, like you said, we're reaching a saturation. Folks just aren't using Kubernetes in production. The good news was that the majority, 70%, said that security was built in from the start. So that's always, my mind always goes, well, what about security? How are they dealing with security? What's going on with security? So it seems like, at least on that front, someone's thinking ahead and not leaving security as the afterthought like they so often do.
But to your point, you hear so often how the shift to cloud native is what's driving platform engineering. And I don't think these two things are as closely connected as a lot of vendors like to make out.
Yeah.
I think platform engineering as a concept exists for both monoliths and microservices-based applications. And it seems to be more about how do we bring some order to the DevOps chaos that has ensued over the years? Because, well, if every little development team has its own tools and its own platforms, it's not long before it occurs to somebody that the cost of all these tools and platforms is exceeding the, shall we say, benefits, especially if you're trying to integrate and maintain all this stuff. So I can definitely see why large enterprises would have a platform engineering team. The challenge has always been, if they do that, will the developers revolt? Because the developers, especially all those agile people, are like, damn it, I'll choose my own tools and devil be damned. So, there's tension in the air.
Yeah, indeed. But so another survey, since we're talking about tools that developers are using, another survey from Logs.io this week was talking about observability, obviously. And it seems like there's not as much progress being made on that front, which also kind of surprised me, at least when it comes to cloud native applications. Now, we covered this on DevOps, but again, there's a lot of crossover there. This survey found only 1 out of 10 respondents said they had full observability into their app environments. That's a pretty terrible statistic.
And even if you do have observability, I was talking to their CTO over there. He pointed out that part of the problem is that all these microservices, they all look alike as far as an observability platform is concerned, because they're built with the same templates. So you don't really know which one of these is more important to the business than the other.
Yeah.
It makes it really hard for people to prioritize what they're going to troubleshoot and when and where and why. And so it's kind of an interesting time, because clearly the application environment is getting more complex than ever with all these cloud native technologies, but it feels like people are just basically, I might throw Prometheus at it from a monitoring perspective, and maybe that's as far as folks have gotten so far. And I'm not 100% sure that people are, shall we say, fixing the applications as much as they're band-aiding the applications at that point. And what I'm getting at is, if I have an observability platform, in theory, I should be able to launch a series of queries that will help me determine the root cause of an issue, and then I can go fix that. I think the problem is most people don't know what question to ask in the first place. So they're just kind of hunting around and kind of, pecking at things and see if something pops up, and then hopefully whatever the issue is at hand stops.
Right.
It's not clear to me that they know exactly why it stopped. They're just happy that they got to the outcome, and then they're like, okay, well, we'll come back if there's a problem.
Yeah. And in that case, you may as well just be using a plain old monitoring tool, right? Because you're using it to do the same thing, whether it's called an observability tool or not.
So I think there's a lot of work to be done, both in terms of observability as a whole. And I'm kind of hoping that machine learning algorithms will come along and kind of surface these issues for folks, and maybe we won't have to know as much about what questions to ask.
Yeah.
Secondarily, the value prop for a lot of these platforms needs to become more explicit. And it's not clear to me that the providers of those platforms are necessarily making that great a case for it, because clearly the number of folks that are doing true observability is small.
Yeah. Yeah. To the point, though, one of the other challenges, I think, is you get all of the data into these platforms. There's not a great way to operationalize it yet. And once you figure that out, that might solve some of it. At least you'll be able to streamline that process. And then, you can use it to train the AI models, hopefully, that can then in the future help you at least identify when the problem is going to happen again, so that it doesn't.
I think the core problem is I think everybody's collecting logs and metrics and increasingly traces, but I don't think they've attached those to specific services. So we're kind of unable to correlate that data into something that would be called actionable intelligence. And that's kind of, this conundrum that people find themselves in the moment. And of course, they spend a fortune on the observability platform, and somebody's asking them hard questions about ROI. And it may just come down to, we just don't have enough knowledge to use these things, and we got to find a way to dumb them down.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. On the security side, though, since I keep coming back to security, it seems like we're making some DevSecOps progress, though, with regard to cloud native. It seems like some folks are starting to figure this out. Is that what you're seeing too?
Yeah, I
fumbling around.
There's a little bit of both. There's a good article up on Cloud Native Now talking about how Cloud Native Now and that transition kind of drives people to embrace DevSecOps. And in my mind, it's almost kind of like a giant mulligan, right? People are going, all right, I'm making this transition to a whole different architecture. So maybe we should revisit the entire DevOps workflow that we're using and maybe get it right from the beginning. Because a lot of these DevOps platforms that have been floating around, they're long in the tooth now. They're 5, 6, 7 years old, and a lot of them were stitched together using scripts and extended this way and that way in ways that might be arguably considered unnatural. and I think what there's an opportunity here is if you're going to shift to cloud native, it might be easier just to get a new CI/CD platform at the foundation of that's built from the ground up for DevSecOps, and use that to manage the cloud native environment while still using the older platforms to manage the monolithic platform. And hopefully you can maybe create a level of abstraction above these things that's a little more federated so that you can have some central control across these things. But I don't think that necessarily trying to extend a DevOps platform optimized for monolithic environments into cloud native and having it continue to run, most likely it's still on premise somewhere, is just too big a lift, and it's too big an effort to maintain. So I think you're going to eventually wind up biting this bullet. Better bite it now than later.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a good point. Speaking of progress, Istio has lost some weight.
This is true. There is an edition of Istio. I guess, I don't know, they call it a mode, an edition. It's up for terminology discussion, but it's called Ambient. Right?
Yep.
And the idea is that, and they announced this initiative last year, and they're getting closer to a beta now, but the idea is that we'll take out the sidecars needed to run the Istio service mesh and get rid of Envoy as the underlying proxy. And we can now have a lighter weight version of Istio, the service mesh. If this sounds vaguely familiar to what we've been talking about with Linkerd and others for a while, that's because it is. But they're also making a case that says that there was going to be a need for the heavyweight version of Istio still in large enterprises. So there'll be some balancing here and there of the right sizing Istio essentially for the right use case. And it seems like Ambient might be more use cases than the mothership, as it were. But
well, that was always the issue with Istio, right? People would look at it and go, I don't need all this functionality. This is way too heavy for anything that I'm trying to do. And, but maybe I still need a service mesh. So then they would go to Linkerd or one of the other lighter options. And it seems like Istio's finally, dialing it back a little bit to try and capture more of that business, which I think is a good move.
Yeah. I think this comes under the heading of customer feedback. So yeah, that's basically where we're going with this. And
Indeed.
Kind of responding where folks are. But I mean, honestly, a lot of folks were like intimidated by Kubernetes itself. And then, suddenly somebody showed them Istio and they just ran screaming from the room.
Right.
So hopefully Ambient will make this whole notion of a service mesh make more sense to a greater number of folks. But you got to do something. And a lot of folks, you could use your basic proxy software as is, or you can get an API gateway. So there's a lot of ways to skin this particular cat. But I think as more microservices show up in production environments, it's only a matter of time before you're going to need a service mesh. But it's not clear to me that day is tomorrow. But sometime in the next year or year and a half, probably. So you should keep track of what's going on with this project, compare it to all the other projects that are going out there. And interestingly enough, just about every one of them is an open source project that is being managed under the auspices of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, who basically is saying, pick whichever one you want.
Right. Exactly. And, like you were saying, it's better that they bite the bullet now and, strip back some functionality to capture that market than waiting until, maybe someone who would want to move is now going to stick with Istio where they wouldn't have had they not made this move. So
I just don't know who's going to be in charge of all this stuff, right? Because theoretically, these are layer 4 through 7 elements of the networking stack. So theoretically, it should be the network operations team, but they're programmable, and the DevOps team is now deploying a lot of the application connectivity issues, or handling that. So there may be a transition where layer 4 becomes more software driven and is handled by DevOps teams. I think that is a ongoing discussion that will be had in various organizations, but the networking guys, they'll always have the pipes.
That is true. Speaking of ongoing conversations, a couple of weeks ago, we mentioned that Weaveworks was no more, but it seems like Civo is making moves to kind of fill the gap that has left in the market as far as GitOps goes.
Yeah, there's this project called Kubefirst, and Civo has acquired the rights to that from the folks who built that project. It's one of these accelerators that has been created for building open source tools for Kubernetes, and they're trying to build an ecosystem around that. And this is one of those types of things that they've created. I don't know about GitOps, and here's my issue. So I have no doubt that people are managing their infrastructure as code, software artifacts, alongside their other software artifacts inside of a Git repository.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just something that they do naturally. Do they wake up in the morning and go, yeah, look, Ma, no hands, GitOps? I think not. I think, what they are doing is basically, this is the most efficient way to manage software artifacts, and they're just kind of going about their daily DevOps mission.
Do they need to put the term around it, or is it just what they're doing?
Right.
It's a little forced.
Yeah, it does seem a little forced these days. And I think, the same conversation is playing out in AI, where those models are artifacts, and those two are going to wind up being managed through a Git repository. And, we don't need 19 flavors of repositories out there. But the one thing that is interesting about the Kubefirst thing is it built heavily around the Argo CI/CD platform. That's this open source project being advanced under the CNCF as well. And this thing is red hot as far as I can tell. I mean, Argo is making a lot of traction and picking up a lot of ground out there. There's a lot of choices out there. And, but, I think because it sits under the CNCF, it doesn't get as much notice as it does from, say, Jenkins or GitLab or any of these other things that are out there. But as far as I can tell, a huge percentage of the folks who are modernizing their CI/CD environments around Kubernetes are landing on Argo.
Yep. I'm seeing the same thing. I feel like it's well on its way to being kind of the standard that people fall back on. No matter where you look, Argo is underneath. So that's going to be interesting to see as well.
And I think a big part of the appeal is that it's just not tied to any vendor.
Yep.
There's been some, consternation about what's going on in the CI/CD space in terms of open source and and which vendors are driving what. But I think people are getting less comfortable with platforms where the bulk of the contributions are coming from one vendor.
Mm-hmm.
And they're worried that the licensing terms might change one day, and there's all kinds of angst in the system, shall we say. So
yeah,
somehow or other, I think in people's mind, Argo is starting to also feel like a safe bet.
It certainly seems that way.
All right, folks. Well, that's all we got for this week. It is baseball season, but I am going to thank Sharon for all her contributions. She's going to leave us. This is her last podcast, and
my last
podcast will continue, but Sharon's going to go take a position with, as they say, another network.
Yep.
And we have enjoyed our time together, and we have been working together for, I don't know, 2 decades or more.
Something like that.
I suspect that we will continue to be working together somewhere in the future. Who knows?
Yep.
But Sharon, thanks for everything you've done, and I hope you've enjoyed your time.
I have. It has been a blast the last couple of years here at Techstrong and the last couple months on this podcast. So folks, keep tuning in. There is plenty more awesome content waiting for you in the future, and catch you all on the flip side.
All right. And see y'all next week.